I'm going to give you some tools to figure out what information you want in your brain, consider how it affects you, and really break down what you will do with the information once you take it in. Then we're going to find some trends so you can filter out future consumption and also learn how to treat information that we don't necessarily want to take in but need to. Welcome to the Love Your Brain podcast, the podcast designed for everyday people who are ready to hop off the negative thought hamster wheel and enjoy a less hostile environment in their own brains. Our brains are where we live our entire lives, and I'm on a mission to help people see that they have everything they need to make it a happier place to be. So join us for this episode of the Love Your Brain podcast. Let's get started. All right, today we are talking about filters. And this intro is going to be a weird one, so stick with me for a moment. I think sometimes as a social worker, I'm like super hypersensitive to triggers. And when something triggers me, I know it could trigger someone else. So I feel like this intro is something I need to say here at the beginning before we get started. Now, when I was originally working on putting together this content, I felt myself being triggered the way I was wording the information, in particular, the idea of filtering. Now, as you'll see, the content itself is not the problem. Once you get into this podcast, you're like, this is fine. But mainly it was just the word filtering. And the way that I was using it felt triggering for me. And although I knew I could probably change the word, I really felt like it would take away from the value. So I decided to leave it. And it just made the most sense to keep the word there. But to give you some background on me personally, I am someone who has been at various moments in my life very enmeshed in conservative Christian culture. And although my spirituality has grown and evolved over time, there were often in the past practices within those churches where the topic of filtering information was a very large part of the religious culture. And this filtering went far to the extent where there were times where I was instructed not to consume a lot of things that most people would consider just a normal part of life. I was told not to consume secular or non Christian music, not to watch TV unless it was religious based, not to engage with certain people unless I was ministering to them. And even in those cases, there were recommended restrictions on that as well. And if you've never experienced this, this maybe sounds really strange. You can probably ignore this part, but if you have experienced something like this, I'm speaking to you specifically in this moment. Please let me put you at ease. This episode is not going to be me telling you that there are certain things you can and can't let in. There's not going to be rules that someone else has developed as to what you can consume. This is not meant to restrict you in any way, shape, or form. This is also not going to be focused on things you need to do to feel like you're a good person or that you have to do X, Y, or Z to deserve anything or to be worthy or to make anyone outside of yourself happy. None of that applies here. This is just information you can choose to use if you want and if you find it helpful. But the idea of filtering in this episode will be much more focused on empowering you to make choices on how to take control of your thought life in a way that feels good to you. Hopefully, to improve your quality of life, but most importantly, to improve your relationship with yourself. I want you to finish listening to this episode and feel empowered to make choices about what you do and don't want to consume when it comes to information. And that's all. Okay, now that very long blah, blah, blah is over, for those of you that have no reference point for what I was discussing, you're probably like, what the heck was that? I did not sign up for that. But I had to put that disclaimer in there for the 1% that may be triggered by the concept of filters. So, anyway, back to filters. When I was working on putting this episode together, it got me thinking about water. A lot of us spend a lot of energy making sure we filter our water to make it safe and healthy for our bodies. Some people choose to just drink bottled water only. Some of us use Britas. Some of us use the filter on our refrigerator for our water. Some people level up and get those fancy Berkeys or even install like reverse osmosis machines in their homes. When it comes to drinking water, typically getting clean water requires two things. It requires both filtering and it requires treating. Water filters are basically like the physical barriers that remove things we don't want in our water. But treatments are different. Water treatments involve more of a chemical or a biological process that dissolves the contaminants so that it's safer to consume. And both of those components are important for getting clean water. Both blocking out what we don't want and treating what comes in make it safe for consumption. And just like water is important for life, so our thoughts are important for our brains. And if we aren't careful about what's going in our brains, we can really create a not great situation for ourselves. So today we're going to figure out how to filter information for our brains and also how to treat it so it's safe for consumption. And because I'm an analogy queen, you may recall in my first episode, I also used an analogy where I talked a bit about how our brains get neglected with information. And to me, it helps to kind of visualize a hoarding situation here. Like when we take in tons and tons of different information without filtering it, we just throw all kinds of things in a room without taking into consideration, do those items belong in that room? Does it align with what the room was made for? Will those items be used or enjoyed in that space? And that's where we're headed today. I'm going to give you some tools to figure out what information you want in your brain, consider how it affects you, and really break down what you will do with the information once you take it in. Then we're going to find some trends so you can filter out future consumption and also learn how to treat information that we don't necessarily want to take in but need to for some reason. So let's start with what you want in your brain. Where we start is just recognizing what you do and don't want to think about, right? Now, of course, there are things you should probably think about because it's important for living, like bills, healthy habits, all that stuff. But today we're going to talk about the optional things, like all the random things around us that we are taking in every day because it's just often where we get overloaded. There's so much information coming into our brains every day. It's crazy. Things like the news, emails we're reading, social media posts, people's conversations around us, music, advertisements, shows, books, podcasts, even information and thoughts being shared in conversations with us. Those are all things that we're going to be talking specifically about today. When you think about all those sources of information you're taking in, we start with just observing it. How does taking this information in make you feel? Do you feel at peace when you listen or read it? Do you get excited or energized? Or does that information cause a feeling you don't like in your body? Like maybe it creates a pit in your stomach. Or do you find that it causes you to start ruminating? Like all of a sudden you can't stop thinking about that. Or on the flip side, maybe the information has challenged your thinking in some way. And maybe you do feel uncomfortable, but it feels like it's a productive thing where your thoughts are leading you somewhere that feels important. Pay attention to how you feel, not just in the moment that you're consuming the information, but how do you feel afterwards? Do you feel exhausted, like it drained your energy? Or do you feel motivated in some way? So let's go back to our hoarding analogy. If your brain is like that room where we don't want hoarding to happen, when you consume that thing, that book, that lecture, that conversation, whatever that information is sitting in your brain, it's sitting in like a room and you're looking at that information in that room. Does it fit there? Does it serve a purpose in there? Or maybe it's that information going to transform that space in a way that's really cool? Or does it not fit at all and you're not sure what you're going to do with it? Or maybe at worst, you're really not even liking seeing it in that space. It's really important to really look at the information we're consuming and ask ourselves, does the information align with how you want to focus your energy? Is it something you think is worthwhile to think about? Is it worth your time in your brain? And we look at the hoarding analogy, even asking, is it information I want to observe in my own brain? Or will it just sit there, not being used, annoying us each time we walk through the room, just looking at it sitting there? We all have those things in our homes, right? That thing we set down at a certain spot because we're not sure where we're going to put it yet. We don't know what we're going to do with it. We know we need to handle it at some point, but we walk past it a million times and it annoys us that we keep seeing it sit there, but we don't quite know what to do with it yet. Believe it or not, we have quite a few thoughts like that in our brains every day that operate in a similar way, where we keep observing it over and over again, not really feeling sure of what to do with it, but knowing it shouldn't keep sitting there. But that's because we're not really filtering the information coming in. So there's just a bunch of junk piling up in our brains that maybe didn't need to come in to begin with. So let's recap. So far, all we're doing is observing the information we're taking in around us and how it's making us feel, how it aligns with who we are and what we want in our brains. Next, I love to ask myself a powerful question. And this one I use literally a million times a day. It's been a super valuable tool for me and a great part of my own filtering. The question is, will this information affect my actions? It's a super quick way to look at information and determine its importance. In my experience, the most important information we take in is the information that will affect our actions, right? Like if someone says there's a bump in the road ahead of me and I'm driving, then I go, okay, this information needs to be there because it affects my actions. Because as I'm driving, I know I'm going to need to swerve to go around that bump. But on the flip side, if that information comes in that there's a bump in the road and I'm not even driving, well, then it doesn't affect me or my actions. I don't need to carry that information around in my brain. And man, when you're listening or reading the news, this tool is super helpful. You can ask yourself, will this information affect my actions? Now that I have this information, what will I be doing differently? It's a great way to check in and just see if you're overloading on information or if this information is actually going to affect your life. And it can help you from idling on information that just isn't adding anything to your life, but maybe it's just sucking the life out of you. But I don't want you to get the impression that I'm saying only worry about yourself and not the world around you. It's quite the opposite. For example, if you're listening to information on the news about a disaster that happened across the country, you can ask yourself, will this information affect my actions? And it's actually a great opportunity to see if maybe you're doing what you should be doing. Like maybe your values really align with helping in this cause. So maybe you're going to dedicate some resources or your time to help them. It really helps you to figure out, is this something I want to take action with? Or if it's something that doesn't align with my values, then I can just move on. As someone with a lot of elderly family members, I find this is something I suggest with them often because, at least with the older people I know who are retired and maybe spending more time at home, they're usually reading or watching the news a lot. And it ends up being something that kind of consumes a lot of their time because they don't have a lot of other things going on. They don't have a lot of other information and inputs coming in. And sometimes what can happen is they get frustrated or upset about all the negative things that they're hearing. They feel disempowered because they're just at home. What can they do? Sometimes they even feel scared. So when they bring this up to me, sometimes I'll actually ask them the question, how is this information you heard going to affect your actions? It can really help them to stop ruminating and to move on and decide, okay, what now? Are you going to take action, or is this information you didn't really need right now and you can just move on to the next thing? This question is also helpful with work interactions. And if you work in an environment like mine, we just get inundated with information constantly. So what I can do is I can look at that information coming in and say, how will this affect my actions? If I look at an email or a conversation, I can ask myself, how will this affect my actions? It saves a lot of energy because I can quickly determine if I need to think about it or just move on. It really helps me dedicate my brain energy to the things that move my progress forward. Okay, so let's review what we've covered so far. We have observed information we're taking in, how it makes us feel, how it aligns with us and our values, and whether the information will affect our actions. Next, we're just going to pay attention to trends. We're going to see what's repeating itself. Are we getting the same feeling from one information source over and over again? Maybe not a great feeling, maybe it is a great feeling. If it is something that we are repeatedly not having a good interaction with, maybe when we leave, we don't feel great, maybe we find ourselves ruminating, any of those negative responses, that might be an area we want to put a filter on. And that filter could look a million different ways. It could be simply spending less time consuming it, or maybe only doing it at appropriate times of the day or the week when we feel like we can manage that information better. But what if it's something a filter doesn't work for? Maybe it's something we can't change our exposure to, or maybe we don't want to change our exposure to. It could be a situation where you have a coworker. You have to work with them, but maybe the information they share with you is not something you want to take in. Maybe they're always really negative or they gossip about other people. Or maybe this is a whole different situation. Maybe it's with a family member you really love, but they always talk about things that bother you. And maybe it's something like they always want to lecture you about politics and you really hate hearing about that. We don't have to change jobs and we don't have to stop hanging out with that family member simply because we don't agree with what they're sharing with us or we don't appreciate what they're sharing with us. In those cases, instead of using a filter and limiting our exposure, we can do more of a treatment like we talked about with water. We can do a treatment on our own brains to help us with this interaction. So when we aren't filtering something out, we can simply do a treatment. And what I'm calling a treatment can be a variety of things. But the foundation of this is creating a new thought that will empower us in the situation and neutralize the effects of the negative thoughts that might be coming in. We know avoiding things, like trying to avoid things actively, really only just makes it worse. Like if you try to avoid thinking about a specific thought, it just keeps coming in. So we're not going to try and just avoid the negativity. Instead, we're going to create a thought that empowers us to really direct energy towards the positive thing we want to have. And this thought could be something just like a simple mantra that helps you in that situation, helps your brain to neutralize the effect of the unwanted information being shared. And it should help hopefully frame the information, frame the situation in a way that's helpful for you. Here are some examples. Something like, I can appreciate the person, but not be like them. Or they are doing the best they can with what they have, and I will do the best I can with what I have. Or we can have different beliefs and still enjoy our time together. Or we can have different beliefs and still respect each other. This mantra should be something that you can mentally focus on to help you create a subconscious division between that person's brain or thoughts and your own brain or thoughts, while still remaining connected. We want this mantra to elicit neutrality towards their thoughts or words and respect for the person, while also creating a subtle separation between your thoughts and theirs. These types of mantras I listed are also helpful because they help to prevent fighting the other person's thoughts or words coming at you. Because the truth is, in some situations where we stay in the energy of trying to fight against someone else's words or their thoughts, we end up actually fighting and having unnecessary conflict with the person we're interacting with. And we don't need to fight any of it. We can simply let it move past us, not pick it up, let it flow by, and not engage with it. So, whatever you need to say in your own brain to allow that simple flow past it, use it. That's going to be the thought that you focus on. And what I really want to highlight here is I don't think our filters should be filtering out relationships. Relationships are so important for us as humans. Obviously, there are cases where you might have to filter out relationships, but I would hope that for the majority of cases, that isn't the situation. I do think some of our cultures lean towards putting in place really strict boundaries with people that are different than us. Can sometimes cause more division than is necessary, and in the long run, it's not as beneficial as we think it is, especially when we try to cut people out of our lives because they believe or behave differently than us. There is value in being able to work, live, and enjoy other people who may have contrasting views to ours. You don't need to absorb all their thoughts or beliefs. You don't need to judge their thoughts or beliefs. We can simply respect the person and let their words flow past us and remain in a headspace that is helpful for us. So let's recap. We're observing the information around us to see how it makes us feel, thinking about whether or not that information or thought affects our actions. We then pay attention to trends over time and build filters to limit our exposure to things that neither add value nor affect our actions. And for the things we do not want to filter or cannot filter, we simply treat. And instead of taking away something, we're adding a thought that empowers us in that experience so that we can still engage with the information and thoughts in a meaningful way, but not have it impact us negatively. Okay, that feels like it was a lot of information today, but hopefully it came together in a way that is helpful for you to use and you feel empowered that you get to choose what comes into your brain and how it's used. I hope you found something helpful here today on the Love Your Brain podcast. Maybe a laugh or a feeling of validation, or maybe just a few moments to have company while you do your laundry. Whatever you take from it, I hope you enjoyed your time and leave feeling empowered to be more you every day. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on the next episode, and leave a review. I'd love to hear what you think. Have a great one.